He waited in the dark for a century, until she whispered his name and brought his heart into the light. Rain swept across the open moors in long silver lashes, blurring the line between sky and earth. The carriage wheels hissed through mud as if fleeing something behind them. Inside, Evelaine Corbyn sat with her gloved hands folded around a single advertisement trembling in her hands. Governess sought for Hollow Manor, immediate placement, discretion required. It wasn't her first position, but it might well be her last. The city had turned cruel since her father's death. Whispers of scandal, debts unpaid, friends too polite to look her in the eye. The posting promised isolation, a wage she could live on, and the merciful silence of distance. Lightning spidered across the moors, illuminating the vast shadow of the estate on the hill. Turrets and chimneys rose like black teeth against the sky. The driver glanced back. "You'll find the Hollow a strange place, miss. Folks say the house listens." Evelaine managed a calm smile. "Then I shall speak kindly to it." The man crossed himself and urged the horses faster. When the carriage stopped before the gates, she saw the ironwork, vines twisted into the shape of thorned roses, their metal petals glinting with rain. Beyond, the manor waited, enormous, silent, the windows burning faintly gold, as though the house itself watched her arrival. The front doors opened without a knock. A single lantern hovered in the darkness, held by a woman of rigid posture and silver-streaked hair. "I am Mrs. Penmarch," she said. "Welcome to Hollow Manor. His lordship is indisposed. You will receive your instructions in writing." Her tone was final, but Evelaine only curtsied and followed. Her boots echoed on marble that gleamed like black ice. Every corridor seemed to breathe. Paintings hung from chain hooks, ancestral faces half faded, their eyes glinting like wet glass when lightning flared through the high windows. They passed a staircase where dust drifted like ash. A faint melody trembled through the air. One note, almost human, as though someone exhaled through the pipes of an unseen organ. Mrs. Penmarch did not pause. "The house is old," she murmured. "It remembers sounds." Her room lay on the east wing. High ceilings, velvet drapes, a canopy bed carved with roses. The hearth was cold. On the desk rested a letter, sealed in black wax, stamped with a silver crest of intertwined ravens. She hesitated before breaking the seal. "Welcome, Miss Corbyn. Your presence is most appreciated. My ward is delicate. Your patience will be her salvation. I must remain unseen until my strength allows otherwise. You are never to enter the West Wing. A.V." The handwriting was elegant but not modern. The ink smelled faintly of cedar and something older. She whispered the name. Aric Valehaven. The candle flared violently. Shadows leapt up the walls, stretching thin fingers toward her. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw someone standing beside the mirror, tall, indistinct, watching. Then the flame steadied, and the room was empty. She told herself it was nerves, and yet, when she blew out the candle, the flame burned 1 second longer than it should have, as if refusing to leave her in the dark. The next morning dawned without color. Fog pressed against the windows like gauze. Evelaine explored cautiously, a small leather journal in hand, determined to prove herself useful. She found her way to the nursery at the far end of the corridor, a bright room dulled by neglect. Dust clung to the curtains, yet the toys were arranged with care, as though waiting for small hands that never came. She began setting out primers and chalk, straightening a tiny desk as if expecting a pupil to appear at any moment. The door creaked. Mrs. Penmarch stood on the threshold, her expression unreadable. "You needn't trouble yourself today, Miss Corbyn," she said. "The child is confined upstairs until the physician allows lessons. A touch of fever, nothing grave, but the master insists she rest." Evelaine turned, startled. "I hadn't realized she was ill." "She improves," the woman replied, then, after a pause, added, The hollow keeps its young close when they're fragile. Before Evelaine could respond, Mrs. Penmarch inclined her head and withdrew, the scent of lamp oil trailing behind her. Left alone, Evelaine studied the neat row of toys once more. The air in the room felt heavy, as though someone had just been there and slipped away unseen. She found the library next, a cathedral of shelves where dust motes spun through slanted light. The air smelled of paper, lavender oil, and rain. A ladder stood pulled out beside a reading desk. Upon it lay an open ledger with a small bundle of fresh violets pressed between the pages. There was no card, but when she lifted the flowers, she discovered a folded note lying beneath them. "Your curiosity pleases me. The house has not known such footsteps in many years. You move softly, but the floorboards remember joy." A chill brushed her throat. She turned quickly, but no one stood behind her. Still, she smiled despite herself. She carried the letter to her room and wrote in reply, hesitating only once before signing her name. "If the house remembers joy, my lord, then perhaps it is not too late for either of you to know it again." She left the note on the writing desk and blew out the lamp. When she woke, dawn had not yet broken, but a new envelope waited upon the sill, the wax still warm as if sealed moments before. "Joy is a dangerous gift here, Miss Corbyn. Hollow Manor was built upon promises that outlived the hearts that made them." The words unsettled her. Yet beneath them, in smaller script, he had written, "But I would not forbid you from trying." Her pulse fluttered. A laugh, or was it a sigh, drifted through the chimney. She whispered to the empty air, "You do hear me, don't you?" Somewhere deep inside the house, a single piano key answered, a soft A note, low and trembling. Days stretched into a rhythm of letters, footsteps, and whispers. She taught in an empty nursery, or thought it empty. Sometimes she caught a glimpse of movement, a pale shimmer darting behind the toy chest. A child's laughter, bright and distant, echoed through the halls. When she mentioned it to Mrs. Penmarch, the woman only tightened her jaw. "The child plays where she pleases," she said. "Mind your lessons and your letters, Miss Corbyn." That night, unable to sleep, Evelaine wandered. Candle in hand, she followed the faint trail of piano music down the west corridor. The walls there were darker, lined with closed doors and cobweb lace. The melody deepened into something heartbreakingly human, a waltz in 3/4 time. She paused at the door to the grand hall. The piano played itself, each note rising like breath-made sound. Dust shimmered in the air, swirling in rhythm. Her candle flame bent forward, drawn as if by invisible wind. She whispered, "Who are you?" The music faltered. Silence thickened, and then a voice, low, velvety, unmistakably male, replied from the shadows. "Yours, if you'll have me." The candle went out. Darkness wrapped around her like silk. She could hear the slow, steady beat of her own heart, and another, faint but real, beside it. A presence brushed her cheek, warm, sorrowful, gentle. Evelaine didn't flee. She stood still, every instinct shouting fear, every deeper one whispering wonder. The unseen voice spoke again, softer now. "You should not be here. The house grows jealous." "Then tell it I will not leave," she whispered back. A pause, then the faintest sound of a man's laugh, warm and incredulous. "Brave little governess." The unseen hand, if it was a hand, lifted a strand of her hair and let it fall. "Tomorrow," the voice promised, "there will be another letter." She blinked, and the warmth was gone. The hall was empty, save for the quiet settling of the piano lid. When morning came, the servants whispered of lights seen in the west wing, of doors opening on their own. Mrs. Penmarch's disapproval carried an edge of fear. Yet when Evelaine returned to her chamber, she found a new envelope waiting on her pillow. "You are unlike the others. The house does not frighten you. It listens to you, and so do I." She pressed the letter to her heart before she realized she was smiling. Outside, the storm began again, but inside Hollow Manor, one candle burned brighter than all the rest. Somewhere deep within the sealed west wing, a locked door sighed, and the echo sounded almost like the beating of wings. Morning came pale and thin, a colorless wash on frost-dim windows, as if the sky itself feared to look in. Evelaine dressed by the weak light and found, beneath her door, a letter that had not been there when she blew out the candle. The wax was the same black crest, the script unmistakable. "Miss Corbyn, did you dream?" She sat on the window seat to read. "You slept with your hand near your throat, as if guarding a secret, and the rain softened its fist against the eaves. Forgive me for speaking of what I should not witness. Habit makes a sentinel of a man who cannot close his eyes. A man, not a ghost, not a rumor." She traced the line again until the words blurred, and only when her breath fogged the winter glass did she realize she had leaned close enough to leave the shape of her lips as a pale oval on the pane. Downstairs, the house stirred to its peculiar hushed industry, ash lifted from hearths, water carried in pails that never sloshed, footsteps that remembered not to echo. Mrs. Penmarch received Evelaine in the corridor with her usual courteous severity. "Letters already?" the housekeeper asked, noting the paper in Evelaine's hand without seeming to look at it. "He writes early," Evelaine said. "He writes always," the woman replied, and something in the tightness around her eyes confessed both pride and sorrow. "Breakfast waits." The meal was solitary, as ever. A single setting at a long table, the silver reflecting 1,000 tiny moons from the chandelier's drops. She took tea, bread, a little butter, and found, tucked beneath her plate, a second note in the same hand. Daring, intimate, mischievous. "You prefer tea to chocolate. The difference shows in your patience. Chocolate promises comfort. Tea demands it." The words should have unsettled her. Instead, she smiled, feeling watched not as prey, but as a poem someone meant to memorize. "Very well," she murmured to the air, "then read me properly." She left the folded page beside the butter and walked into the day as if it belonged to them both. The nursery had been tidied again by no visible servant. Chalk dust on the slate wrote a sum neither she nor any human hand had inscribed. She rubbed it away with the cuff of her sleeve and set out primers. The little chair gave its slow, contented creak. Evelaine kept her gaze averted, gentle with the pretense. "If you are here," she said softly to the emptiness that was not empty, "we'll begin with letters." She lifted the hornbook. "A is for—" A breath of cold touched her knuckles, and a whisper, not words, merely the idea of a child's breath becoming a laugh, brushed her skin. She turned her hand, palm up, the way one offers a biscuit to a shy foal. "It's all right," she said. "I have time." The candle on the mantel guttered, though the window was closed. Evelaine waited until the room settled again, then spoke to the silence as if it could take dictation. "Today we will not press you. Today we will read for pleasure." She read aloud from a slim book of stories, nothing frightening, nothing grand. A tale of a little ship on a calm sea under a kindly moon. Her own voice soothed her, and by the end she could have sworn that something small leaned against her skirts, the way a child will when the plot grows tender. When she glanced down, there was nothing to be seen, but the hem of her gown pressed inward as if held by cautious fingers. Later, in the library, another letter waited on the central table. No violets this time. The ledger stood open to a page soothed by many strokes of a careful hand. In the margin, a sketch of a candle, and beside it, a single line. "I am allowed no church. Grant me your voice instead." She looked up and found, on the balcony above, the drag of shadow that might have been a man leaning over the rail to watch. It vanished when she blinked, but the hairs along her arms did not lie flat again for several minutes. She wrote at once, standing, the nib scratching lightly. "If there is worship in reading to a child, then I will be a priest every morning." She left the paper in the book and walked to the west corridor without admitting it to herself. The west wing breathed colder than the rest of the house. The panes were stained with storms older than any servant living, and the carpet's floral pattern had faded to ghosts of petals. At the threshold of a door veined with age, she paused. The handle felt like winter. It turned easily. The study beyond had kept its own time. Books lay open on the desk as if their reader had merely risen to fetch more light. A quill stood in an ink bottle, the tip still black. The smell in the room was not dust alone. It held the memory of tobacco and rain, ink and iron and something like cedar sap. On the desk, to the right of the blotter, a third letter waited, unsealed. He had not bothered with ceremony here. You were always going to find this room. The house knew it the moment you crossed the road. Evelaine set the letter down before she read further. Her eye had caught a second thing, a small leather-bound journal, crushed petals trapped in its ribbon. This writing was not his careful, formal script. It sprawled and tightened across the page with all the life of a man arguing with himself. Notes, schemes, remedies, names of doctors, sketches of talismans copied from books with too much gold on their spines. She turned a page and saw the date, and her mouth went a little dry. The year scrawled there had no business in the present century. It was a mistake, or a joke, or... She pressed both palms flat to the paper to keep them from shaking. It was not. A girl's name recurred like a litany. Clara. Not a ward. A sister. Had she known? Of course she had known nothing. The house had told her only in echoes. The living preferred deflection. Evelaine looked around and saw it at last. The small things that would not have survived careless hands. A ribbon tied around a pencil stub. A doll's spoon tucked beneath the desk's lip as if hidden there between lessons. This had been a room of love before it had been a room of grief. She returned to the letter and forced herself to read slowly, line by line, as if a priest reciting a rite must not stumble. I sought to buy time the way a fool might buy a horse he cannot ride. There was a ritual in a book I should have burned. It required less faith than cowardice. I lacked neither. She lifted her gaze to the window. The glass was old enough to wobble the world. Her own face looked pale and double in it. I asked for Clara's breath to be held. The price was the house. It has a talent for holding. The words went silent on the page, as if the ink itself could grieve. Evelaine pressed her fingers against the desk to steady their tremor. She did not weep, though her eyes ached with it. Instead, she closed the journal gently and touched the ribbon flat in a gesture the room might recognize as respect. "You loved her," she said aloud for the first time in the study that had known it, "and you did something terrible for love." The air changed. She felt it without feeling air at all, a hush the way the inside of a bell holds its breath before the strike. Behind her, near the hearth, a cold gathered itself until it resembled a man. Not sight, not yet, but a weight upon the space that a body would occupy. She did not turn toward it. She kept her palms on the desk as if warming them at a flame. "You should leave," the voice said, nearer than it had ever been, wrapped in sorrow like velvet around a blade. "The house does not forgive the curious." "I read your notes," she answered. "Forgiveness is not what you asked the house for." A silence, almost a laugh, almost a sob. "No." "Clara," she said, and the name spoken whole shook something in the walls. She laughs when you read," he said, and the pride in him was so bright she had to bite her lip to keep from speaking too quickly. "She hums. The toys move the way they used to. She likes the part with the ship and the calm sea. You watch us." "I have no other practice left me," he said, and the gentleness undid her. "Then watch," she whispered, and turned. "Watch me not leave." The first sight of him was not a sight at all, but the shape that light makes when it refuses to pass through an idea, a density in the air, a thinning of the world, a cold that was not cruel. He stood where a man would stand, near the hearth that would not burn, the outline of a shoulder, a throat, hair that absorbed the light like night water. And the eyes. She should not have been able to see the eyes, but there they were, pale as a winter star's reflection in deep water. He lifted a hand, and light from the window slid over it as if unsure. "Evelaine," he said, testing the name as a violinist might test a string. She stepped closer. Her heart beat very hard. She willed it to behave. "Lord Valehaven." He flinched as if the title pained him. "Aric," he said, as if she, and only she, might be allowed to say it. "If you must." "I must," she said, and lifted her chin as if that might help the world decide what rules to keep. He had no shadow on the floor. She looked and saw only a veil of cool air where a man's feet should have pressed a mark. But when she shifted her weight, the boards creaked, and his gaze flickered to the sound, with a concentration so living she felt the breath catch low in her ribs. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly, because questions were the only way forward through certain rooms. "It hurts to want," he said simply. "And it hurts to remember wanting less." That earned its silence. They stood a long time in a conversation that did not require words. It required the living and the almost living to agree, bandit-like, to meet between laws. At last he said, "You carry a locket. You open it only when you cannot sleep." She reached for it by instinct and stopped, startled by the intimacy. "How?" "The house tells me," he said, and his mouth, now a mouth, a line of shape and thought, curved. "And the way your hand seeks your throat, as if to remind yourself that blood still listens." "You write like a man," she said. "You speak like a man. You stay where a man might stand if he were very stubborn about his promise to remain." "You read like a cathedral," he said, "and walk like someone heaven is sweet on." Evelaine lowered her eyes so he would not see them shine. "You have not been near sunlight for a very long time." "At times the east windows permit me a color that resembles morning." The humor in him astonished her. "It behaves poorly and does not last." She took one more step. If she lifted her hand, it would be foolishness. If she kept it at her side forever, it would be a worse kind. She lifted it. "May I?" she asked, though she did not yet know to what. "You may do almost anything," he said, "and I will pretend that it does not undo me." She set her palm against the air where his cheek ought to have been. Cold met flesh, but not the cold of a grave. The cold of water drawn deep from stone, full of unspent summer. Her fingers tingled. She felt resistance, the way one feels the presence of glass in darkness, invisible until it pushes back. And then, a thing both impossible and very small, beneath her hand, the faintest flutter, as if a bird caged behind ice had lifted its head to listen. Aric's eyes widened the way a man's do when the tide, unbelieved, returns. He closed them, and for an instant he looked not haunted at all, but simple and young and humanly tired. "Again," he whispered, as if a prayer might be coaxed by repetition. "Please." She held her palm steady until her own hand trembled. The flutter answered once, twice. Centuries fastened briefly into a pattern a body could understand. She drew away only when the room warped a little, with the pressure of the thing they had dared. He opened his eyes. Light this time found color in them where none had been, the barest wash of blue at the rim of winter. "Do not be afraid," he said, though his voice shook. "I am," she admitted, "but not in the way I was taught to be." His smile, how had she not known a ghost could smile, startled her into a laugh that sounded too loud in the small, consecrated silence of the study. He looked at her as one looks out a window and sees the ship that will bring the news one has already written down for oneself to survive. "There are rules," he said, and the word was weary. "I did not write them, but the house enforces them the way some men enforce secrets." "Then we'll step between the lines," she said. "A governess does little else all day." "You will be hurt," he said. "I will fail. I am very good at failing, it seems." "You failed at leaving," she said. "That is not the same as failing at love." Again that nearly laugh, roughened, reluctant, grateful. "Miss Corbyn." "Evelaine," she said, and watched the name cross his mouth like light crossing winter water. Their next days became a rope bridge pulled across a canyon they would not name. She read in the mornings to the empty chair, while the chalk without hands wrote careful copies of letters and sums with small mistakes no scholar would make. A tin soldier marched half the width of the hearth when she told a story about bravery. Once, as she recited the quiet last page of a book where a ship at last finds harbor, a weight leaned against her knee for 3 breaths and then went shy again. Evelaine did not startle. One does not startle holy things. At noon, she walked the conservatory where roses had gone stubbornly blind with winter. In the fogged glass, she often found the trace of a handprint that matched no servant's and melted as she watched. In the late afternoon, she wrote. She found a corner of the library the house seemed to like for letters. Light fell there gently, even when the sky forgot to produce it. She drafted, scratched out, wrote again. He answered before the hearth cooled. They discussed nothing and everything, whether forgiveness is a room or a road, how silence can be a knife or a salve depending where it is pressed, what a house might be if no one had ever been afraid inside it. She learned the pattern of his nearness. When she stood in doorways, thresholds, places for choosing, he was strongest. When she crossed rooms without looking down, he followed like rain moving beneath cloud. When she said Clara's name, the air sweetened. Sometimes, late, when the candles had burned to patient knots of wax, a music box melody wandered the corridor and stepped into her chambers as though it had never stopped playing in another life. On the 4th evening after she entered the study, she found him there again. Not an accident. Expectation hung in the room like an extra breath. "You are thinner," he said, which was absurd and endearing. "You eat enough to persuade your heart to remain?" "I eat more than your letters," she said, "but less than your absence requires." "Ah." He moved almost toward the hearth. "I am sorry for what the house takes away in order to let me speak." "You are not the house," she said, fiercely enough that it surprised her, "and we will not let it convince us that you are." He inclined his head as a man might when allowed, for the first time in a month, to sit. "You teach with the dictionary closed," he said. "It is a noble vice." "Then learn with the windows open," she said, and set her hand where his should have met it. The flutter came quicker now, not steady, no living man's pulse, but present enough to pull tears behind her eyes that she did not let fall. He stood very still. "You cannot carry this weight forever," he said at last, hushed. "But if there's a measure of it you can let me hold, I will." "You already do," she said. "You hold me to the truth of why I came." "Which is?" "To be seen," she said, "not as a pity, nor as a problem to be moved from house to house, but as a woman who might yet make a home in a place no one else could want." He made a sound then that had no category, not a cry, not laughter, not words, but the noise a heart makes when it lifts too fast after too many straps. The house did not approve. They felt it before they knew they felt it. The draft shuddered to life beneath the door like a dog brought to heel. The curtains trembled without wind. A thread of soot climbed the cold chimney and returned as a whisper with no source. Not a voice exactly, but the pressure of one. "Enough," Evelaine said, very calmly. "No." The words sounded small and human and entirely sufficient. She placed both hands, palms open, on the desk that had held his journals and spoke as if to a recalcitrant child. You may keep your doors and your petty winters. You may count the steps I take and blow out candles when you think the hour too late. But you will not take his voice when he has only just remembered how to use it. The pressure withdrew like a sulk. The curtains fell quiet. The house listened the way a wounded thing does when it recognizes a physician's tone. Aric's eyes shone. You will make enemies of walls. I have lived in smaller rooms than you can imagine, she said. None of them taught me to behave. Later that night, after words came easier again, Clara made herself seen at last. It happened as simple as breathing. Evelaine was gathering the primers in the nursery, speaking aloud the plan for the next morning so no one would be surprised. Letters, then sums, then the story about the harbor if you like it still, when the air to her left gathered into a girl. Not the dramatic unfurling of a sheet or the ghastly silliness cheap tales prefer. One moment there was light, thin as milk. The next, a small figure began to exist where light had agreed to thicken. Pale hair like frost on wheat, bare feet, the toes a little smudged, the way a real child's always are. A blue dress that made no sound when it moved. Eyes as clear as river glass in very shallow water. You have a kind voice, Clara said, without any prelude. It doesn't hurt my ears the way some voices do. Some voices try to make the air their shape. You let the air be. Evelaine wanted to kneel so badly her knees ached. Instead, she lowered herself to the little chair as if seeking its permission. I am happy to see you, she said. The child nodded, terribly earnest. I am not supposed to show myself when it's noisy, she said, as if confiding a rule about biscuits. But it is quieter when you talk. Even the house listens like this. She tilted her head, as if greeting an attentive cat. My brother is almost alive again. Evelaine's throat closed around the word brother. He loves you very much, she said, and the little girl's face did a complicated thing, ease and ache at once, a child's version of a widow's smile. I know, Clara said. He plays the piano the way he used to when I was too tired to sit up. He thinks I don't hear the wrong notes, but I do. She leaned in, a conspirator. He's worse at waltzes when he's sad. I am worse at everything when I am sad, Evelaine confessed. Clara considered this, then offered one hand as solemnly as if presenting a thimble. Then we should make him better at waltzes. Agreed, Evelaine said gravely, and extended her own hand, stopping short of contact before she remembered whom she met. How shall we begin? With the part where the ship finds harbor, Clara said, with the swift, absolute wisdom of children who have slept in rough seas. That is the best part for teaching houses. They read. The room warmed a degree not measurable in glass. When the last page turned, Clara's outline thinned. She plucked at the air where Evelaine's sleeve would be and whispered, Do not let him give me away to the priest when the priest comes. There is no priest, Evelaine said, without knowing until the words were spoken how much truth they aimed to make. Only a woman with a stubborn voice. Clara smiled, and then she was only the idea of a girl. And then she was the hush that meant she would return. That evening, in the study, Evelaine told Aric plainly what she had seen. He did not look surprised. He did not look anything for a long moment, and then he looked like a man who had kept himself from moving for 1 year too many, and now did not trust his knees. She should have gone, he said at last. I asked for her breath to be held, and so the house took the request like a master takes a coat from a servant, without asking if the season requires it. I should be punished every hour. You are, Evelaine said, and stepped close enough to risk both their rules. You are punished by hearing her and being unable to kiss her hair and tell her she is safe. Consider this punishment acknowledged. Now choose use. What use can a man with no pulse serve? You have one for a moment when I touch you, she said. That is not nothing. And we are to spend the rest of our days counting to one? He asked, tired and wry and almost smiling at his own foolish courage. Until we count higher, she said, and if we cannot, then we count louder. She laid her hand against him again. The flutter came, quicker now, briefer, yet brighter, as if the small bird had heard its name and pretended, for decency's sake, that it had not. His eyes closed. He breathed as if breathing were something learned, not given. Clara says you are worse at waltzes when you are sad, Evelaine murmured. He laughed softly, the sound rough with gratitude's sand. Clara has always been an expert in my failings. Then we must rehearse. She lifted her other hand, foolishly, gloriously, and for an instant the room pretended they could dance. He stepped forward as if his weight could be remembered. The study tolerated 3 beats of a waltz, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and then the house shook itself like a wet dog and the desk shivered, and Aric pulled back with an apology that had no language left to inhabit. You see, he said, as if to explain the ocean to a fish. You see. I see your eyes warmer, she said. I see sunlight where there was none. There is no sunlight, he said, almost gently. Then there is the evening equivalent. She lifted the spent candle, cupped its faint thread of smoke, as if encouraging the shape of what would come. And we will name it until it arrives. They walked that thin path for days. She, with her patient, stubborn human rituals. He, with his delicate trespasses upon the laws of absence. Once, passing a mirror, she saw him fully. Not his face, which the glass refused, but the exact way a man resists laughing when he knows he will. And she laughed for him, and the house did not know where to send its draft, and so sent it nowhere. On the last night of the 2nd week, the storm that had been pacing the hills all day came down like a verdict. Rain battered the windows. The piano, of its own will and his, played something not quite a waltz, not quite a prayer. Evelaine went to the study because of course she did. He was there because of course he was. The candle would not stay lit. Then don't, she told it, and set it aside. We do not require you. She found him by the window. The dark made him less thin, as if it loved him too much to let him vanishingly belong to it. She could not see his mouth, but she heard it smile. I am learning to stand, he said, and the pride was small and perfect. You are learning to live, she said, and set her hand to the place where his pulse would have been. The flutter came and held long enough to be an answer. The house rose against them. It came first as a pressure in her ears, then as a smell, old weeds drowned in a cistern, then as a voice that was not a voice but the shape of one. Leave. No, she said, patient as a tutor, refusing to let a pupil quit on a sound the mouth can make. We will stay until you remember what windows were for. The shutters rattled in their iron housings and fell still. The pressure climbed and then backed down the way a tide does when it discovers the shore has grown taller. Somewhere far away, a door slammed itself and regretted the echo. Tomorrow, Aric said, low, almost into her palm, there will be another letter. Tonight, there will be a promise, she said, and the sentence steadied him the way proper punctuation steadies thought. Clara will not be given away. You will not be dissolved to please a superstition. And she made herself say it as if she had always known, I will not run from the work of loving you. He did not speak. He did not vanish. He stayed, which was the more difficult verb. The flutter beneath her hand grew, not steady, not enough, but nearer to a pattern that bodies trust. That, she breathed, unable to help it. Again. The house listened and, for a span of heartbeats that human minutes could not measure, remembered what it had once been built to hold. Not fear, not bargains, not a loneliness made holy by practice, but a family's ordinary miracle of breath shared across a room. When it ended, As all miracles do before the next begins, they stood quietly, shy with victory. "Do not ask if I am real," he said at last, very soft, as if ashamed to want it. "Not tonight." Evelaine lifted her hand from him and let the warmth she had stolen from impossible hinges linger there a moment before the air took it back. "I would not insult what I can feel," she said, "and I would not distrust what I have decided to keep." "Keep me then," he said, with the awkward bravery of men who have learned late to beg. "For a night, for a letter, for as long as the house allows." "For as long as I do," she answered, and knew that the word had changed shape while she spoke it. They parted, not because the house demanded it, but because people who mean to endure know when to end a good hour while the spell is still speaking kindly. In her chamber, another letter lay waiting, the seal so fresh it had printed the crest into the thin frost that had gathered on the glass. "I have failed at many things. Tonight I failed at surrender. Forgive me. It was the first mercy I have enjoyed in a century." She wrote until her hand cramped, then wrote beyond the cramp. "There is nothing to forgive. Tomorrow I will bring the book with the ship and the harbor. We will teach the house to like the ending." She set down the pen. The storm softened like a hand that has pounded a door too long and fears it will be opened. In the lull, just before sleep took her, she heard a child's laugh ripple down the corridor and into the cradle of the stairs, and beneath it, lower, fractured but present, the steady growing cadence of a thing the world had not finished betting against. A man's heart practicing its lines. For a few blessed days the weather forgot to hate the moor. Rain fell softly instead of with fists, and the fog lay like clean wool over the hedges. In that gentler light the house learned to behave. Clara appeared more readily, first as the idea of a girl, then as the simple fact of one, small and intent, her blue dress whispering rather than chilling the air. Aric gathered himself along thresholds and doorframes, learning the patience of wait, the posture of a man who intends to stand. Evelaine read in the mornings until her voice wore a smile of its own. When she closed a book, the nursery kept its heat a little longer than it ought to have. The house listened, sulking less each day. Once, while she set a saucer of milk for the kitchen cat that belonged to no one, Evelaine felt a touch at her sleeve and looked down into Clara's earnest face. "Could I have the ribbon from your hair?" the girl asked with absolute politeness. "Only for a while. It helps the air remember where you were." Evelaine untied the black ribbon and laid it across the child's palm. The fingers that closed around it were nearly warm. Clara lifted it to her own hair with grave ceremony. "Now the house will be nicer," she said. "It likes to borrow things that mean staying." Aric later in the library doorway. "You make pacts with walls." "Evelaine, I am a governess. I make pacts with everything that thinks it knows better." He would have smiled fully if he could have borne that much living in daylight. Instead, the movement hovered like a coin just before it is caught. But the house had not forgotten what fed it. In the silences between their small happinesses, the stairs creaked as though they learned a new weight of anger. Door latches grew stiff as grudges. Twice, passing the west corridor at dusk, Evelaine felt a draft climb her spine as if taking measurements. Even the piano, docile as it had grown, put a wrong note into the end of a lullaby, the way a warning pinches a dream. On the fourth such day, the knocker struck the front door with a zeal that had nothing to do with weather. Mrs. Penmarch, lantern already in hand, though noon had not yet faltered, went down to receive whoever would intrude. Evelaine, in the hall above, paused in the shadow of a balustrade and listened to a voice like a shovel biting clay, pious, satisfied. "By letter of the solicitor," the man said, "and upon consultation with concerned parties, I am come to cleanse this place of its profanations." "Mr. Ketro is a concerned party about the price of glass," Mrs. Penmarch answered flatly. "He is never concerned about breath." "Breath belongs to God," the stranger declared, and stepped inside without waiting. The house sighed. Even the weather drew back against the windows. In the echo, Evelaine knew two things at once: that the newcomer was a priest of some shabby order more fond of implements than mercy, and that the house would rather be destroyed than relieved by such hands. She met him halfway down the stair, plain as a schoolmistress, her chin raised, her eyes as civil as raindrops. He saw in her only a woman to be directed. "You are the governess," he said, as if the word might be a smaller coin than woman. "You are mistaken about your duties." "My duties are well acquainted with me," Evelaine said. "They are not in need of a priest." He took from his bag a bottle of brackish water with a lilt of Latin on its label and a bundle of iron nails bound with twine. "Where there is fear, there is a door," he pronounced. "Where there is a door, the right hammer." Mrs. Penmarch moved between them with a swiftness that belied her years. "You will not go up while my lamp burns," she said, "and it burns until my master himself bids it go out." "Then let him bid," the priest sneered, finding courage in cruelty. "Let this invalid show the house a face." "He already has," Evelaine said, not softly, "and the house preferred it." The man's eyes narrowed. He lifted the bottle as if it were a cudgel and flung a percentile of its contents toward the stair. The drops struck the oak with a hiss. The oak struck back by not being impressed. Somewhere above, doors whispered along their frames like teeth, deciding whether to bite. "Go," Evelaine said to Mrs. Penmarch, without taking her gaze off the intruder. "Find Clara. Tell her to hide in the green closet behind the nursery hearth." "She will not be alone there," the housekeeper said, more prayer than statement. "I know," Evelaine answered. "Go." Mrs. Penmarch went. The priest laughed, short and ugly, and pushed past to mount the stairs. "Out of my way." She did not move. He put a hand to her shoulder to shove her aside as one moves a chair. The house took this personally. Wind, with no season to account for it, came down the corridor the way a temper walks into a room determined to own it. The sconces flared blue and went out. The chandelier over the stair made a sound like ice breaking on a river. The priest staggered, steadying himself on the rail, and found the rail grown so cold it burned. "You see?" he cried, aching with the pleasure of being justified by horror. "You see what I come to master?" "You came to make a frightened thing more afraid," Evelaine said, "and you congratulate yourself that the fear shouts." She felt Aric gather near her, the pressure of a presence that would prefer to face a sword than see her touched. "Get back," he whispered. "Please." "No," she said without turning her head. "I have taught worse boys than this." The priest drew from his coat a length of rope cleverly knotted. "The child," he said. "The house keeps a child. That is the vilest trick of all." Evelaine took a step down toward him. "If you so much as name her aloud, I will call every brick in this place to stand between you and whatever door you think heaven has given you leave to open." Her voice shook only because rage and fear are cousins. "You know nothing of which breath is held here, nor why." He lifted the rope as one might raise a banner of bad intent. The house did not wait to be begged a third time. It shrank the stair beneath him by a hand's width, not enough to throw him, enough to introduce him swiftly to humility. He lurched, cursed, landed hard on one knee, and bit his tongue so that piety tasted blood. The rope thumped, the bottle skittered, the nails spilled into a small star on the rug. "Go," Evelaine said, gentler than he deserved. "Take your implements to the solicitor who hired you. Tell him the house is under new tutelage." "And if I decline?" he spat, rising, dignity a poor coat on his shoulders. "Then the house will decide on a lesson that suits your scholarship," Aric said, so near that the words came cold as water across the priest's scalp. The man's eyes widened, not at belief, but at the bad luck of being outnumbered by what he had invited. He went, because even fools can count. When the door shut behind him, the house exhaled so hard the curtains fought to stay civil. Evelaine put her palm flat on the rail and breathed as a woman breathes after she has chosen to continue. Aric stood beside her, a ghost without ghostliness, not visible to a stranger's argument, visible enough to her that sight was not required. "You should have let me be the arrogance," he said, aching with pride and fear and admiration all at once. "You have been too much else," she answered. "It is time I take my turn." But peace, once broken, returns with conditions. That evening, the shutters rattled in their casements, though the wind had gone to dine elsewhere. The keys on the piano pressed of their own accord at odd hours, never in song now, only in a pattern that felt like the tapping of a foot that cannot bear to sit still. In the nursery, the toys set themselves not right, but almost right, as if someone small had tried to tidy while frightened fingers trembled. Clara did not come when Evelaine read the first 2 pages of the harbor story. On the 3rd page, she appeared with her dress askew and her eyes huge, and she stood very close to Evelaine's knee, as though not certain which world she must stand in to be safest. "What is it?" Evelaine asked, keeping her voice as round as a lullaby. "The house has remembered being hungry," Clara said, with the matter-of-fact sorrow of children who have learned too soon to name such things. "It thinks we forgot we are food." Aric, in the doorway, was little more than gravity and a wish. "There is a storm behind the walls," he said. "It will spend itself on us if we do not teach it else." "How?" Evelaine said, looking from the child to the not-quite man, as if both were candles that might choose to burn out without asking permission. "Tell me how, and I will do it." He hesitated the way a man hesitates when the prescription is a pain he would take himself if he had a pulse to carry it. "The letters," he said at last. "Burn them. The house clutches what holds me. If you undo the bridge, I may fall where I belong." "And where is that?" Her voice hardly found her mouth. "In the ground," he said gently, "or in the air, but not beside you in a way that endangers you both." Clara jerked as if someone had tugged her ribbon. "No," she said fiercely, hands fisting themselves against logic. "No, no. If you burn the letters, you burn the part of him that writes. He will forget the shape of words. He will forget my birthday. He will forget how to answer a song." Evelaine's knees chose the floor without consulting her pride. She wrapped her arms around the child that was almost warm. "We will not burn what keeps a man speaking," she said into pale hair that smelled of the first breath of snow. "We will not choose silence and call it safety." Aric's presence trembled. "The house will choose it for us," he said, bleak. "It can read my fear faster than I can hide it." "Then we will read faster," Evelaine said, and for a moment the weight of years, pronouns, prayers, and promises seemed to have chosen her mouth as the place they would be made new. They carried the box of letters to the grand hall, where the piano waited like an animal that might yet be gentled. The house gathered around them with bad intention disguised as architecture. Doors that had never groaned discovered a creak at last. The chandelier swayed, as if remembering a ballroom where no one laughed. The very rugs took to gripping souls. Mrs. Penmarch brought the tinderbox because tinderboxes are for hearths, not for saints, and one must choose which work a flame will do. "If the house means to have a bonfire of things that matter," she said, "let it be the last fire it tends." Evelaine knelt beside the box and put her hand on the first letter she had ever received here, the one that smelled faintly of cedar and old oceans. She did not lift it. She did not need to. Words do their work through paper as easily as through air, and she had already learned to make air behave. "He said hello," she began, voice steadier than her bones, "but not like a man who expects courtesy back. He said it as if the greeting were a door and he had decided he knew how to open it." She read, not with her eyes, which would have blurred from salt, but with memory. She spoke his phrases back into the house that had taken them, and with every cadence the air found the old shape of his breath. The house shoved. The house sulked. The house rattled the windows with both hands like a drunk late for a blessing. She read on, letter for letter, day for day, until her throat went hot and then cold, and then found a new way to be strong. Aric remained close, learning a discipline of remaining that would have impressed any academy. He did not vanish when the drafts crawled under the piano and bit at his ankles. He did not dim when the chandelier broke a single crystal and let it fall like a tear onto the carpet. He took the shape of a man and kept it, which is a more faithful act than marriage vows said and forgotten. Clara stood with both palms pressed to the floorboards as if listening to the house's bones. At a page where his handwriting had grown ragged, he had written through a night of doubt and bad weather, she began to hum the waltz he pretended not to love. The key of the piano nearest her shivered. Another key yielded a timid note. The melody, too shy to be called one yet, found itself a spine. "Again," Evelaine said to both of them. "Again, again." She read his line about light he could not touch. She read the one about her footsteps sounding like rain. She read the foolish little joke about tea and patience until the house, starved for seriousness, did not know whether to be offended or persuaded by the human fact of such kindness. The walls answered with their worst. Wind poured down the chimneys and forgot to leave. The hearths stank of old winters. Somewhere upstairs, a door Evelaine had never seen slammed itself so hard that plaster dust came down like a first snow. The chandelier gave up a second crystal. The piano snapped out a cluster of wrong notes, like the last things a man says when his apology has not been taught to him in time. "Enough," Evelaine said to the air with the patience of a woman instructing a tantrum to choose a smaller room. "You had your price. You will not have what you did not pay for." Clara lifted her head. Her eyes had become the color of a sky about to forgive itself. "It is not only angry," she whispered. "It is afraid. It thinks if we stop belonging to it, it will be only a house and not a god." "Then we will teach it how houses love," Evelaine said. "Not by keeping safe." She reached for Aric without reaching. He came to her as if coming were a verb he had always known. She set her palm where his cheek had learned to be. Beneath it, faint but definite, the small bird lifted its head again. The house howled, a sound without throat, a weather that belonged to no sky. Mrs. Penmarch drew breath as if she could keep them all alive a second longer with that one act. "Now you," Evelaine said to Clara, not looking away from Aric, though the room bullied itself around them. "Say his name." The girl set her mouth like a soldier and spoke it with a child's bell-note courage. "Aric." "It is a strange thing, how the world rearranges itself around the truth of a name, said rightly." The wind broke against it like wafer against tongue. The chandelier steadied, though no hand touched it. The piano, embarrassed by its earlier tangles, found the root note of the waltz's beginning and held it as a penitent holds a candle. Evelaine did not cry. She had work to do. "Again," she said gently. Clara said it again. Mrs. Penmarch added in a voice that remembered him at 6. "Aric, mind your shoes." Evelaine added, "Aric, please come to the window." The house, exhausted by fury and starved of what it pretended not to need, made a long wounded sound, and then fell silent, in the way a thing falls silent when it has listened at last. Light entered. Not a dramatic spear from a heaven with good timing, rather the plain dawning of a morning the weather had not scheduled. It crept through the stained glass and washed the floor with the meek bravery of milk. The pain over the piano, which had fogged in all seasons since the old winter, cleared first. The keys brightened, shy of their own polish. Dust lifted itself and could not find where to fall. Aric looked at the light the way a man looks at a letter that has traveled too far to be laughed at. It touched his shoulder. He flinched, and then did not flinch. The edge of him, which had accepted for so long the discipline of less, took on color as if the painter had finally chosen to return from lunch. Hair, black, lashes, darker, mouth, the living red of words. The place beneath Evelaine's palm beat. Not a flutter this time, not a bird that might be lying to be kind, but the small, stubborn hammer of a heart that has decided, in defiance of treaties, to ring. He inhaled. It seemed impossible that he had not been breathing all along. He had made all the noises of a man who breathes. But now he took air like a debt paid in full, and the room forgot to pretend it had not been waiting. Clara clapped both hands to her own chest and made a sound that would have been a sob if it had belonged to grief. "Again!" she squealed, which is a holy word if spoken in the right room. He exhaled, laughed, and then, what courage it requires to ask for too much, exhaled again. Color returned to him in shy places. The ears, the lips, the nails. The smell of cedar became the smell of skin. The room visibly chose to remember joy. "The child," he said hoarsely, as if the throat were an instrument returned from long loan. "Clara." "I am here," she said, and the house did the last of its resisting. A crack stitched up the far wall from baseboard to cornice. No ruin, only a seam healing. The air warmed in a way that did not belong to weather at all. The dust in the high corners turned to small, clean threads that fell into nothing. The door that had slammed upstairs opened by itself and then closed again with courtesy. On the garland of the chandelier, where 2 crystals had fallen, roses that had never seen sunlight on that landing chose to bloom. The house had made its decision. Clara, who had chosen everything first, changed in the smallest of ways. Her feet, which had kept the respectable smudge of remembered earth, took on weight. Her fingernails pinked. When she pinned Evelaine's ribbon in her hair, the ribbon did not go through her. It lay against her like a claim. "Your hands," Evelaine whispered, not trusting the word child to carry so much wonder without spilling. "Show me your hands." Clara held them out, solemn. They were not warm yet, but they were not the cold of a place that cannot hold heat. They were the temperature of bread just set to rise beside a good oven. Evelaine took them both and kissed each small palm as if the palms were relics from a chapel no map had ever deserved to draw. Clara laughed and startled at the tickle of breath, as any living girl would. Aric fell to his knees, as if the room had grown too high for standing, then stood because he could, then swayed because standing is an art after a winter of stone. Evelaine went to him fast enough to forget grace and caught his shoulders. The material of his coat rasped beneath her fingers. Flesh pressed back beneath the cloth. He was heavy. She loved the fact as one loves news one has written to oneself for safety. "Careful," she said stupidly, laughing, ashamed of nothing. "You have a body now. Do not be reckless with it." He took her face in both hands, and because he was a man again and had learned to be careful, he asked without speaking. She answered without words, and the answer was yes. When he kissed her, the house put every window in order, because what else is a home for? After a while, it was necessary to sit down and become considerable again. They did so where ordinary people do, on the edge of a rug that had survived 4 generations. Mrs. Penmarch brought bread without asking whether anyone was hungry. Bread answers hunger without curiosity. She set a cup of milk in Clara's hands, and when the milk left a white mustache on the upper lip that had been made of light an hour ago, the housekeeper turned her face to the cupboard and wept for the first time in the years the house remembered. "Will it last?" Evelaine whispered into Aric's shoulder, not because she doubted, but because humans ask their joy to name itself twice. He listened, not to the house, which he would continue to hear as one hears a loyal old friend clearing its throat in the evening, but to his own breath as a man listens to a river after a drought. He pressed his palm flat to the floor. The boards answered with a creak so plain, so blessedly ordinary, that he laughed again like a boy. "It will last," he said. "This is not a bargain. This is forgiveness." The day unfolded itself like a letter that had been read before. Meals that belonged to mouths, rooms that belonged to use, corridors that gave up the habit of watching and decided to be walked. When dusk came, it came through clean glass, and the colors it brought with it were unafraid of being named. Evelaine lit a lamp because a room looks lovelier when a hand has asked it to glow. Aric stood beside her and discovered the small ceremony of trimming a wick. Clara fell asleep in a heap of reasonable blankets and did not vanish when the clock in the hall struck the hour. The weather remembered its theater and sent a fine rain to make the roses pin their scent against the stones. The stones, properly chastened by love, decided to smell of rain and not of graves. In the morning, how polite and revolutionary a morning is when it is shared. Evelaine walked into the courtyard and felt the sun choose her hair for a path. Aric came after, slower, astonished by warmth on skin. He held one hand up like a man meeting a bird that agrees to land there because it has found the right person at last. Clara, between them, wore a crown of white petals she had surely stolen from no one but Spring. There was no need of a priest. There was a need of witnesses, and so the house provided every portrait it had and asked them to pay attention. Mrs. Penmarch stood where a mother might stand and trembled only twice. Tomlin Gray, the stable hand, who had always spoken to horses as if they were scholars, and to scholars as if they were tired horses, found a violin in the attics and coaxed it into the sun. Music that had once been forced from the piano's throat now walked on human feet. Evelaine wore a gown that had belonged to a Valehaven bride no one had taught properly how to be happy. She wore it happily, which is the better tailored. Aric, in his father's waistcoat, made the fabric feel proud of its work. Clara scattered petals with the efficiency of a general and the glee of a child who has discovered she may throw beauty and not be scolded. They spoke their vows with the care of people who have earned the right to mean them. They did not promise impossible things. They promised the possible ones, to keep a house kind, to teach a small girl how to waltz before she can spell every difficult word, to read aloud on storm nights until the storms choose to listen, to be stubborn when sorrow suggests surrender, to open windows on mornings that look shy. When they kissed, the portraits knew to soften without looking away. The house, convinced at last of its proper role, held the walls square, the roof sound, the light in the right places. Later, when the guests had become family simply by staying, when the last ribbon had been untied from Clara's hair and tied again because ceremony enjoys repetition, Evelaine and Aric walked the corridor of the west wing without fearing the draft. The study had kept its furniture but surrendered its old laws. The journal lay where it had lain. Evelaine touched it as one touches a relic without making a religion of it. Aric took up the quill and made a simple entry in a hand that belonged to the present day. Today the house learned to be a home again. Today my sister is alive. Today I married the woman who taught us both. If ever I am foolish in the days to come, let this line shame me into sense. He laid the quill down and wiped a dot of ink from his finger with the small irritation of any living man. Evelaine loved him for it more than for any miracle he had performed by standing still and breathing. Clara, feet bare, danced 3 measures of a waltz with herself in the doorway and called them both slow. Night came without tricks. The candles outlasted their wicks by only the proper margin. When Evelaine climbed into a bed that no longer remembered the weight of grief and Aric lay beside her with a startle at the luxury of it, rain went on politely outside, and the wind, having learned better manners, asked the eaves before making a sermon of itself. Clara slept at the foot of her own bed without falling through the mattress, and when a music box in the hall wound down, it did so with gratitude rather than complaint. Toward morning, just before the pale moment when night chooses whether to pretend to continue, Evelaine woke to a small sound like laughter carried in a thimble. It came from the garden. She slipped from beneath the blankets, drew on her shawl, and went out into the courtyard where the roses held their breath to see what the people would do next. Clara crouched by the lowest branch of the oldest rose. She had found a bird there that had fallen from its nest. It was unhurt, only offended by gravity. Aric arrived a step after Evelaine, his hair untidy with sleep, and his smile the sort a house might build itself around if given a choice. "Gently," he said, and he and Evelaine lifted the branch enough for Clara's small hand to guide the bird back to its home. The nest accepted the returning heart without comment. Above them, the sky made a new blue to celebrate the trivial miracle of a remedied fall. Clara looked up, squinting as if she had not remembered how bright the world is when it intends to be. "We are very good at rescuing," she announced, businesslike. "We are," Evelaine said, taking her hand. "Let us be very good at nothing happening for a while," Aric said, and if ever a prayer was answered instantly, it was that one. The day went on. The house kept its roof over them. The piano, of its own free will, learned the waltz properly. When evening found the windows, it entered with the ease of an old friend. Evelaine opened her leather journal and wrote a single line, because some lines are better than sermons. The hollow does not whisper anymore. It hums. Aric, reading over her shoulder, nodded. Clara, planted on the hearthrug, with a book she did not yet know how to read, asked, "What does hum mean?" "It means a house has decided to be full," Evelaine said. "Of what?" "Of us," Aric answered, and the house agreed by saying nothing at all. If you like this story, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps this channel grow. Thanks for watching.